Well, this morning we move on to our study, in our study of Acts, to chapter 23. And you remember last week, Paul had gone to Jerusalem, and he went to the temple to do some Jewish things to show that the Jewish people that he had not abandoned Jerusalem. And while he was there, minding his own business, not causing any trouble, somebody noticed him, and he said, "Hey, that's Paul. Remember him from Asia? There's a big riot. They were in the process of beating Paul to death. When the Romans heard there was a disturbance, they came, they took him away from the crowd, they brought him back to their fortress or their center where the military was at, and they were fixing to, he asked for an opportunity to make a presentation to the crowd out there, and God for a moment made the commander stupid and had him say yes. So Paul went in and he started speaking to the crowd, and the crowd was perfectly quiet, listened to what he had to say, and he went over and he told his life story, how he'd been a persecutor of the church, he'd been met Jesus, he had then was called to serve Jesus, and the crowd was perfectly willing to listen to what he had to say until he reached what point? When did things blow up? And God has sent me to the Gentiles. And at that point, the crowd explodes. Away from such a fellow from the earth, he ought not to live. And so they bring him inside, and they're fixing to examine him by scourging, basically torture the truth out of him. And he mentions he's a Roman citizen, and things change real fast, don't they? So the commander, we're not going to do that. And so the next day then, well, we'll pick this up. So that's where we're at. Paul is held half prisoner, or maybe a third prisoner, and two-thirds in protective custody by the Romans in Jerusalem. And I'm going to pick this up at Acts 22:30 and read through 23:10. The next day, because he wanted to know, this is the commander, wanted to know for certain why Paul was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and their council, that would be the Sanhedrin, to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. 23:1. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, "Men and brothers, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law?" And those who stood by him said, "Do you revile God's high priest?" Then Paul said, "I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people.'" But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of the Pharisees. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." And when he had said this, dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' parties arose, protesting, said, "We find no evil in this man, but what if a spirit or angel has spoken to him? Let us not fight against God." Now, when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him to the barracks. Okay. So, a couple things here. Paul says the high priest commands that he be struck, and then Paul responds, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. And there are two ways that this can be taken. One is that Paul regretted responding to Ananias in such a harsh way. The other, and I'm inclined to think this is more likely, is that there was some sarcasm being employed here. Oh, he's the high priest? You could have fooled me because he sure isn't acting like the high priest should act. That kind of undertone of the idea here. Whichever it is, that's what Paul said, and he calls him a whitewashed wall. Now, that's interesting. Jesus referred to the Pharisees as whitewashed tombs. The idea that on the outside they looked really beautiful and inside they were full of rottenness and decay. But here he uses the term wall. Stifler makes the observation that they were a wall. They were a barrier against the gospel. And in 12 or 13 years after this event occurs will be when General Titus invades and destroys Jerusalem. The temple is destroyed, and the Sanhedrin as an institution comes to its end. So judgment is fixing to come. And then he gets into the meeting, and Paul sees an opportunity here because he knows the intense rivalry between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and he exploits this rivalry, and he gets into fighting among themselves. And this works really well because it allows the Roman commander to see what he's dealing with. I think he had some idea if he'd been stationed in Jerusalem for a while, but he had some idea of what he was dealing with, and there's no issue about Paul doing anything here that should concern the civil government. This is simply a dispute among the Jews, but he gets this big discussion going.
Sadducees and the Pharisees were also very political, lining up, supporting different political philosophies, whatnot, and it had been going on. In fact, I think it was the Sadducees that backed and the Pharisees that backed Caesar. Romans invaded. So the divide was huge. I just think it's like the divide we have now. How hard would it be to go into a meeting? Throw a few comments out there and get the fighting all over.
Okay, and if you can hear all Jay said, there was a political dimension, not just a religious dimension to their disagreements. And the Sadducees tend to align more with Rome, and the Pharisees more with the popular sentiment in the blue collar popular sentiment. And if you have a mixed group of Democrats and Republicans, how easy would it be to find a lot of agreement, or maybe easy to find a lot of disagreement between the two factions? So there's historically a lot of hostility between these two groups, which Paul exploits. Now, I think Paul is smart enough to know this is only going to work once. After this meeting, I'm sure they went back and said, look, the next time we get in front of the Romans, we can't let this happen again, okay? So, but at any rate, that's how this ends, with Paul's back in the barracks and he isn't torn to pieces. Okay, and then we move on. So, back in the barracks, 23:11. But the following night the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome." One little verse, but there's a lot in that. As was mentioned last week, I think, by Tim, that we have this debate, Paul was warned that bad things would happen to you in Jerusalem, bad things would happen to Jerusalem, bad things would happen. Should he have gone? Was he being disobedient? And I think this suggests not. There's no word of censure here, like, Paul, I told you not to go to Jerusalem. This is what was going to happen. the Lord says, as you have testified for me in Jerusalem. There seems to be some appreciation behind that. Yes, you faced some difficult times, but you went and you testified before me in Jerusalem, and now you must testify before me in Rome. And I'm sure Paul was human. He could have used some encouragement about then right now. And I'm trying to think, help me out if I'm wrong on this, but I cannot remember another place in the Bible post-ascension where Jesus is referred to as being on earth communicating with anybody. We have in Stephen, in his stoning, the heavens opened, and he looked up and he saw Jesus standing in heaven. Paul on the road to Damascus had the voice of Jesus coming down. But I can't think of another place in the New Testament where we see Jesus physically, post-ascension, on earth. But here if somebody can think of one, please share it. Standing beside somebody to reveal himself to them and encourage them. So this is a big thing that he does for the Apostle Paul. This verse provides direction for the rest of the book of Acts. You must bear witness to me at Rome. And then, so the rest of Acts now is about Paul getting to Rome. And I'm sure it was an encouragement for Paul to know, hey, right now I'm in jail, but my ministry's not over with. God still has something for me to do. I'm going to go to Rome. I'm going to do something for him there. So I'm sure this was a big encouragement. Okay. Now, moving on. Questions? Acts 23, 12 to 22. The Jews' plot revealed. And when it was day, some of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And there were more than 40 who had formed this conspiracy. Now, this gives you some dimension of the fanatical hatred that they had for Paul. Even if it wasn't a large contingent, attacking a group of Roman soldiers that were escorting a prisoner was going to be a very dangerous activity and would likely result in some of them getting killed. So great was their hatred of the Apostle Paul that they were willing to die to kill him. They came to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a great oath that we will eat nothing until we have killed Paul. Now you therefore come together with the council. Suggest to the commander that he be brought down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to make further inquiries concerning him. But we are ready to kill him before he comes near." So when Paul's sister's son heard of their ambush, he went and he entered the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called the centurion to him and said, "Take this young man to the commander, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the commander and said, "Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to say to you." Then the commander took him by the hand and went aside and asked privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask that you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more fully about him. But do not yield to them, for more than 40 of them lie in wait for him, men who have bound themselves by an oath that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for the promise from you." So the commander let the young man depart and commanded him, "Tell no one that you have revealed these things to me." Now, one thing I noticed in the passage, and Claudius Lysias, I guess I was what the man's name is. This is a pretty sharp guy. I'm kind of taking a liking to him. Consider the possibilities. You know, he's a big shot. He's the commander of the Roman forces in Jerusalem, and one of the guards brings to him a prisoner's nephew, probably a teenager, and says, this guy has something to tell you. Now, my experience with bureaucracies generally would be that the reaction I would expect is an eye roll and, sure kid, don't worry about it, you know, everything's okay. We're big boys, we know what we're doing. His response to the young man, I think he understands that it's very, I'm sure, very intimidating to this young man talking to the head commander there. He was a Roman. The Romans are occupiers. He was the top Roman guy, and he took him by the hand and went aside and asked him privately, "Come here." He seems to be treating him kindly, trying to put him at ease. He says, "Now, what is it you have to tell me?" He's willing to listen to what this young man has to say. Puts him at ease, willing to listen. So Paul's nephew tells him about this plot and all that, and then he says, "Okay, don't tell anybody." And we move on to now what he does about it. We're in Acts 23 through 35. Yes, and we'll see how seriously. And he called for 2 centurions. Now, centurions typically were officers who were over about 100 men. That's the idea of rank that they had. So he called for 2 centurions, saying, "Prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night and provide mounts to set Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor." So he's ordering up a force of 470 soldiers, which is quite a commitment of manpower. Also, while they're gone, the fortress there at Jerusalem is going to be 470 soldiers short of men. I don't know what the total contingent was that were stationed there, but he's sending a small army with Paul. And it's I also found interesting, he asked for mounts, plural, to set Paul on. I guess the idea, if they had to ride fast, that he would have 2 horses, and I'm assuming they were horses, that he could change back and forth from one to the other to keep a fresh horse, because he specifies mounts for Paul to be put on. And he wrote a letter in the following manner. Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. Coming with the troops, I rescued him, and having learned that he was a Roman, and when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council. I found out that he was accused concerning questions of their own law, but had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains. And when it was told to me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you, and also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Farewell. Now, if you've noticed, Claudius takes a little bit of liberty with the facts and the way he explains these things to Felix, but we'll give him good marks. He's trying to protect Paul's life, and he makes it clear in his letter that the sentiment is that Paul had done nothing worthy of any concern of the Roman government, that this all had to do with the dispute about the Jews about their own religion, and sends that along with Paul. And he's sending him to Caesarea. Now, Caesarea was the Roman headquarters in the Levant. So they had a contingent of troops in Jerusalem, but if you wanted to where the big headquarters were, where they're, the Fort Benning or whatever of the Levant, this would be Caesarea. So it was a Roman town. There were a lot of Romans there, and there was a very heavy military presence. So if you wanted to protect somebody from assassins, Caesarea was a really good place to have them. Also, I'm sure that Claudius was just as soon glad to have Paul out of Jerusalem so that there wasn't some attack at Jerusalem that would create trouble that he'd have to deal with. You send him to Caesarea, and now he's going to be in a much stronger location if there's any trouble. Felix can deal with it. But he's sending him to Caesarea.
About some Jewish guy that somebody wants to kill. To the headquarters, and to look out for it.
Okay, now, what Jay said was, this showed you how valuable a Roman citizenship was. That why should the commander care about some Jewish guy that other Jews want to kill? But because Paul was a Roman citizen, he deploys a small army, really, to take him to Caesarea and make sure he gets there safely. And hold that thought, because there's another idea that we're going to stack on top of that as we get to the end of our study here. So he sends it. Did I get? No, I didn't get there. Okay, let's go a little bit further. And then the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And the next day they left the horsemen to go on with him and returned to the barracks. And when they came to Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and also presented Paul to him. And when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from. And he understood that he was from Sicilia. And he said, I will go and hear your accusers. I will hear you when your accusers have come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. Okay, so Antipatris, and depending on which commentary you read, it's 40-ish miles from Jerusalem. And then from there, Caesarea would be another 25 miles. Basically, the whole army took Paul as far as Antipatris and then spent the rest of the night, and then the foot soldiers went home, and the cavalry went on to Caesarea, I think under the theory that the assassins were left in Jerusalem, and I'm sure as they went back to Jerusalem, they were watching the road for any suspicious group of people coming the other direction. So they didn't need the whole 470. He went on with the 70 cavalry on to Caesarea. Let's see, we talked about the letter not being truthful. Caesarea. Okay, and Paul was likely, the praetorium kind of means headquarters. And it could be anything from a tent to depending on the circumstance, but in this case, it happened to be Herod's palace, which was, pardon the pun, palatial, fairly palatial. It is likely that Paul was under a form of arrest/protective custody where he was not free to leave, but he was given, under house arrest, he was given decent quarters and not locked up in some dank dungeon in the basement. We don't know that for sure, but the term that let's see, kept in Herod's praetorium, it is likely that his conditions of imprisonment there were not harsh. So So now, this is the end of the chapter. Paul is in Caesarea waiting for the council to come and bring charges against him. And I'll leave it to every teacher's next week to fill you in on some of the character of Governor Felix, which has an interesting background. Now, some comments. In his narrative, and this goes to Jay's comment about the protection of the Roman citizenship. In his narrative, Luke intentionally contrasts the Jews, and especially the Sanhedrin, with the Romans. Stifler writes in his commentary, if Luke lingers thus over the story and fills it with details, he must intend to show how God's invisible hand could use the world power, which he had ordained, to serve him in protecting his servant from apostate Judaism. Those who have fallen from the right are ever more mischievous than those who never possessed the right. For in this case, pure heathenism, with its natural sense of justice, did more to protect the kingdom than those who professed to know God but did not. So Luke is kind of in this thing making a contrast between the injustice of when Paul, as a Jew, goes before the Sanhedrin of Jews, the injustice with which he's treated, and when Paul, as a Roman citizen, goes before the commander, the great care and deference is given to protect his rights as a Roman, and the pagans were doing a whole lot better than protecting their pagan citizens than the Sanhedrin was in protecting their fellow Jews. So with that, if we look at chapter 23, what lessons can we learn about living our Christian lives here in 2025, Monday through Saturday? Are there any takeaways we can have here? Ed? Okay, good. Speak the truth boldly. Okay. Speak boldly the truth. Yes. God can use earthly rulers to preserve us, save us, and work for us. Yes. If things don't look like they're going well, it doesn't mean that they aren't. Where did Paul want to go? Where did he express earlier in Acts that he was planning to go? Okay, and we never know if Paul made it to Spain or not, but he mentions a number of times the desire to go to Rome. Where did Paul go? He went there. Where did Paul go?
He got a free trip to Rome.
He got all government-paid trip to Rome. Tim. The king's heart is like the rivers of water. He turneth it which in the Lord's hand. He turns it whichever way he will. Okay. Okay, God had a plan for his evangelism, and God made sure that Paul was in the right place at the right time to do what God wanted him to do. Didn't necessarily always work out exactly the way Paul was expecting it to work out, but it worked out the way that it needed to work out. I think one thing I noted here is that if it's God's will that you do something, he will protect you and provide the protection and provision necessary for you to do whatever that something is that he's really called you to do. And the thing kind of bugs us is, I think sometimes God calls us to do things, and we correctly understand his call, but we've got it all worked out exactly how it's going to happen, and God doesn't always bring it about exactly the way we thought he was going to do it, but if he's called us to do something, he's going to enable us to do it. Yes, Jay?
Comfort and care we probably never but in spite of that, life is full of physical pain, emotionally. I think that's something.
God used Paul's physical pain and emotional pain to God's glory to accomplish his purposes. Yeah. Tim. Yes, we're not told.
Not told, but I feel a little.
They got themselves a good Jewish lawyer to get them off the hook, huh? All right. Well, let's close in prayer. God, thank you for your word, and thank you for the history where we see your care of your servants. Help us to remember that you're still the same God that lived back 2,000 years ago, and that same care is available to us, not just to the people we read about. We ask in Christ's name.